So now we're going to cover part 3 of the Zippy Microservice structure and functionality. And as promised in part 2, we're going to talk about how and why you might want to create a custom SQL query using the Jakarta Persistence API. And in this case, we're creating something that is not going to be generated automatically by the Spring Data API. Why do we need to do this? Well, first and foremost, there are some limitations on how you can combine Spring Data API keywords in order to be able to get functional queries. And in particular, one of the more curious ones, it's a bit of a head scratcher, is you cannot write a query method that combines containing with in. So if you wanted to be able to take a list of queries, list of query strings, and then say, find anything in the rows in the database that match any of the queries in this list, it can't do that. So in this case, we'd like containing to search for a specific substring in a field or in a column in the database, and in should search for a field or a column that matches one of several values, and you just can't do that. Now, it took me a long time to figure out why you couldn't do that. In fact, what I ended up doing was asking ChatGPT why it didn't support that. And it gave me back a pretty good answer. This answer I have here is what it gave me back a year ago when I asked it the question. When I asked it like a couple days ago, it gave me back a better answer. And so I put a link to my ChatGPT site, which you can go and take a look at to read the more comprehensive answer. Good luck trying to find a detailed explanation using a Google search of why the Spring Data API methods can't combine containing and in. I've really never been able to find anything that explained that in any coherent way. So good example of how ChatGPT really helps to provide insights that otherwise are just difficult to extract using traditional web searching mechanisms. So let's talk about the MultiQuery repository. And the reason we have this is to work around the limitations with the Spring Data API. And in particular, we're going to go even one step further than what I just showed you to define a more powerful type of query. And this is a custom query. And this is part of the MultiQuery repository, which, as you can see here, is an interface that the Zippy quote repository is going to extend. So here's what that interface looks like. It's called MultiQueryRepository, and as we'll see in a moment, it provides the means to perform multiple queries at once on the quote database. And here's the particular method we're going to define. Now, this is something you cannot do with the Spring Data API, so you have to write it yourself as a custom query. And what it's going to do is it's going to find a list of all the quote objects in the SQL database that contain all of the queries in the queries parameter in a case-insensitive way. So here's an example. So let's say we have a database that contains all of the Zippy the Pinhead quotes, and we want to find all the quotes that match both Yao and Yet. And if you do that, I should have made it clear that it'll find more than these three, but it'll certainly find these three. And so if you make this query against the database, it'll come back with Yao, am I cleansed yet? Yao, am I having fun yet? Yao, are we laid back yet? And there's some other ones too, but those are three of the ones that I picked. And what's interesting is if you look at the actual SQL, you can write this SQL statement, sort of, but you can't easily programmatically, you have to do it in a programmatic way. You can't easily do it through a query that you would provide through the query mechanism or by the way in which the data API works, because it won't do this query for you. So the query is select anything from the quote table where the lowercase quote column is like something with Yao in it, and it's like something with Yet in it. So the question is, how do you actually write this code? How do you get this to work? So we can't generate it automatically by the Spring Data API, so we've got to do something else. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply the Spring repository implementation pattern. And this is a very cool pattern that's very useful to know. And what you do is you make a class with the suffix impl that has the same prefix as the name of the interface that you're implementing. That is the repository implementation pattern. Again, good luck trying to find the explanation of this pattern with a Google search. It's very hard to find. So once again, I use ChatGPT. I memorialized its response here. You're welcome to take a look at it. And this gives a nice, concise, but thorough explanation of how this pattern works, how it's baked into Spring. It's actually quite cool. The way this works under the hood is we have to write some code to implement this method. And as part of that, we're going to have an auto-wired field called EntityManager, which is an entity manager. And that defines a database session that our program that we're going to write, our Java code, can use to perform CRUD operations and query the SQL database. So this is something that comes out of the box, and it actually, of course, is used under the hood by the mechanisms in the JPA that you normally get for free without having to write any imperative code at all. Here's a little snippet of the imperative code that we have to write in order to do this. And as you can see here, there's a lot of pieces to it. What this does, again, is it will find all the quote objects in the database that contain all the queries in the list of queries and the parameter in a case-insensitive way. And it's just super duper cool once you take a look and see how all this works. And we'll talk about how that works when we get a little bit further along. So it's actually in another upcoming lesson that shows how to implement this microservice. We'll actually walk through the code. Why do you need to know this? Because you'll need to implement something like this for an upcoming assignment. So that's the end of part 3 of this section.